So I'll introduce our speakers for this evening. So Jaya Jacobo is a trans feminine thinker and artist based at Coventry University. Her work focuses on trans feminist pedagogies in literature, art, and performance. Jaya holds a PhD in comparative literature from the State University of New York and an ABMA in literature from the Ateneo de Manila University. She has held numerous influential positions, including being a board member of the Society of Trans Women of the Philippines and a fellow for advocacy of the Asia Pacific Transgender Network. Jaya is also a founding co-editor of Queer Southeast Asia, a transgressive journal of literary art, and co-editor of BKL, so B. Cole or Bakla, I think I'm pronouncing it correctly, Anthology of Bicolnon gay trans queer writing. Maria Rafaela Silva is a scholar, human rights activist, and researcher. She holds a PhD in communication from the Fluminense Federal University, a bachelor's degree in art history from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and a master's degree in history theory and criticism of culture from the State University of Amazonas. Maria has an exchange student at Nova University of Lisbon in Portugal, where she studied gender, migration, and globalization. She is currently a visiting professor at Federal University of Pará in law studies, focusing on human rights. So tonight, Jaya and Maria will present their reflections on trans resistance and solidarity in the global South and how trans feminist sorority in Brazil and the Philippines continues the revolutionary legacy of Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. So over to you.
Yes, I prepared something from, previous work and ongoing work. And most of my work in transfeminism has been in collaboration with my dear friend and colleague, Mariah. Actually, we're going to see each other in a few days in Brazil for another leg of our research. And it's somehow strange to be seeing her in this somehow formal situation when we talk about these things almost every day, but always a pleasure to share the stage with Maria. And I guess Maria wouldn't mind if I say that while we have prepared something from ongoing or previous work, we are actually more interested in the dialogue after our speeches, because this is an opportunity for us, trans scholars from the Global South, Brazil and the Philippines, to dialogue. We've been wanting to have this conversation with you folks in South Africa as well. All right, so I'll just go for it. The title of my talk is the Trans Feminist Movement in the Philippines through Brazil to South Africa. Good afternoon. Thank you for this invitation. Historically and genealogically, trans women in the Philippines have descended from gender-diverse, non-binary trans feminine priestesses who participated in animist rituals of the community prior to the empire. When the Spaniards came in 1521, they were relegated to assistance of Catholic priests in the evangelization of the islands, leading to the negation of their divine role and eventual disappearance, if not erasure, from public life. The coming of the Americans in 1898 cemented their invisibility due to discourses of modern psychiatry, introduced to install binary notions of sex and gender, disseminated in the public education system. The Japanese colonial period relegated these women to sex work to serve as military men of the empire. Confessions from living survivors have been documented in media and cinema. While the non-binary trans femme utopia of the ancient past have become almost mythical as memory, it has not stopped Filipino trans women of the present from harnessing its vernacularity to dream of a trans feminist future. In 2002, the first organization of trans women in the Philippines was established by a group of women in Metro Manila who call themselves the Society of Transsexual Women of the Philippines, or STRAP. 4 years later, the Coalition for the Liberation of the Reassigned Sex, COLORS, was also established in Cebu City. A decade later, Gender and Development Advocates Ganda Filipinas, and the Association of Transgender People in the Philippines, ATP, the Trans-Pinay Association of Antipolo, TAO, Diyos sa Taguig, Gayon Albay, Lakambini Advocates Filipinas, and clinics dedicated to and initiated by Filipino trans women, like Victoria by Love Yourself and Lily by Diosa, were also established in the archipelago. These trans organizations must contend with exigencies of contemporary trans life in the country, which has been, for now, permanently hampered by two landmark legislative moments. Since 2007, when the Supreme Court of the Philippines upheld the Court of Appeals' overturning of the Regional Trial Court decision in favor of Meli Silverio, it has been impossible for trans people in the country to affirm themselves via official documents. With epigrams lifted from the Bible on God creating, and I quote, man in his own image, end of quote, and a passage from a folk myth establishing the sex binary through the primordial figures of malakas, strength, and maganda, beauty, the decision proceeds to ask, and I quote, when is a man and when is a woman a woman? May a person successfully petition for a change of name and sex appearing in the birth certificate to reflect the result of a sex reassignment surgery? End of quote. Meli Silverio, who has just received her PhD in sociology from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, came home to the Philippines to have her documents changed after undergoing hormone therapy and psychological testing in the US, and gender affirmation procedure in Thailand. Her Filipino doctor and her American fiancé served as witnesses in the trial. The Supreme Court decision states that since there is no law in the state that addresses sex reassignment, the petition is fatal to Silverio. It asserts its fundamental intervention on the question of sex and gender, however, by saying that, and I quote, the sex of a person is determined at birth, end of quote. A predicament that transgender people contest in their adult affirmation of their gender that is misaligned with their birth sex. Furthermore, the decision buttresses its case by referring to a denotative definition of sex as the, and I quote, some of peculiarities of structure and function that distinguish male from female, end of quote. Specifying male as, and I quote, the sex that produces spermatozoa for fertilizing ova, end of quote, and female as the, and I quote, the sex that produces ova and bears young, end of quote. Given the reproductive premise of the argument, woman as merely a conduit and the egg cell of the offspring that develops from it, the pros can only exclude people, and I quote, who have undergone sex reassignment, end of quote. And even proceeds to argue that a particular case, if affirmed, may have effects on the notion of marriage and the status of women. Of course, because woman in this sense must only be born as such, the partnership acknowledged by the state must be with a man as such. The ruling included the exhortation that legislative intervention is necessary for the definition of sex to include that of transsexuals. While transsexual subjectivity is named here as a future possibility that is to be embodied in a law to come, its presence is also foreclosed in the defense of the sexual binary and the refusal to acknowledge the distinction that gender identity may present to natural and normative preconceptions of male and female bodies in the Philippine state. A contrapuntal case must be cited to signal some sort of movement from these laws as far as trans as a category is recognized judicially. In 2008, just a year later after Mel Silveri lost her case, Jeff Kagandahan, an intersex person, won his appeal to affirm himself through his chosen name and gender marker. A crucial paragraph in the Supreme Court decision must be quoted here at length, and I quote, "In deciding this case, we must consider the compassionate calls for recognition of the various degrees of intersex as variations which should not be subject to outright denial. The current state of the Philippine statutes apparently compels that a person must be classified either as a male or a female, but this court is not controlled by mere appearances when nature itself fundamentally negates such rigid classification." Here, a purportedly more enlightened perspective on nature is made possible, not only with the intersex figure as negation of the law, but with the agency of such being in nature to identify himself according to a gender he has chosen. And I quote, "Respondent here has simply let nature take its course and has not taken unnatural steps to arrest or interfere with what he was born with. And accordingly, he has already ordered his life to that of a male," end of quote. Nonetheless, as it is revealed that Jeff's gender only appears to be concomitant to a concept of nature as inevitable because preordained, in the end, such gender is intimated by as ancillary to nature itself and to the sexual binary premised on such an a priori. The decision attempts to free itself from such binarism through the liminality that only an intersex figure can summon as a space of deliberation and judgment, and yet it does so asymptotically insofar as the predominant notion of natural sex is preserved in the end. If the decision is to be read as a para-basis for trans recognition in the decision to come, then intersex subjectivity can only serve as that moment that enables a cusp to emerge as an opportune moment in enabling the judicialization of gender diversity. That is, according to subjects who dare contest the limits, as well as the licenses that the law can instantiate. If the aspect of agency in the decision to accept the gender one has become is recognized as natural to intersex subjects, as it attends to their condition from predicament to volition, can it also be extended to transsexual and transgender subjects? Or will the concept of nature revert to its previous composure when confronted with the unnaturalness of interferences the latter decides to assert as affirming herself? This was a missed opportunity. The Philippine Constitution of 1987, ratified in the Republic, established after the fall of the dictator Ferdinand Marcos, is phrased to include the promotion of the dignity and human rights of all Filipino citizens. But no matter how activists and their allies harken back to this fundamental law, what happens on the ground remains contentious as far as transgender people are concerned. Many A-trans women have been harassed and arrested for simply walking the street at night, with police assuming they are promenading for sex work, still considered illegal by the state. Colonial and neoliberal prejudice are entrenched in all aspects of life, that no trans person is ever given equal opportunity for a life of well-being. How many trans people have been denied work when during the interview, they are revealed to be trans and if ever offered a job, only with the precondition of changing their present self-presentations during their first day at the office. If given work, are these women allowed to carry the names which affirm them? Are they also given the freedom to choose the restroom of their gender? No and no. The killing of Jennifer Lauder remains a traumatic event for the trans population of the country, while American serviceman Lance Corporal Joseph Scott Pemberton was sentenced by the Regional Trial Court of Olongapo City in 2015. If not for the murder charge filed with the prosecution, but for homicide due to passion and obfuscation and intoxication. In other words, trans panic. Then President Rodrigo Duterte also pardoned Pemberton in 2020. How can trans women feel safe in the country when their gender identity can be used against them in instances where their right to life is threatened? How is it possible to contend with loss and survival itself when transness, as far as it is judicialized in this case, becomes the alibi for death and violence? It is in this scene of violation confronted every day by transgender and transsexual people that a legal framework to grant them citizenship for the name and gender that are fundamentally pertinent to their affirmative political visibility is without question necessary. This granting of such gesture of the right to gender self-determination is a genre of judicialization that can only combat the current mode of justice according to trans folks in the state. That is, if not criminals who have broken the law, victims who by sheer jurisprudential eligibility cannot be upheld by the law itself. Trans people in the Philippines remain bodies which populate the already suffocating spaces of a highly cis-heteropatriarchal prison industrial complex, a sphere where they are doubly incarcerated as objects of pleasure and violence by inmates of the opposite sex. Trans liberation in the Philippine context must be articulated not only in conversation with the general LGBTQI movement. Take note, however, that the Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Bill, Gender Identity Expression SOGI Bill, has languished in the Congress for more than 20 years, but also in colloquy with our larger debates on women's rights, which have yet to include notions of cisgenderity and transness. Gender identity must be distinguished from sexual orientation and assigned birth sex in public discourses. Moreover, the oppression of urban poor in the slum, peasants in the agrarian margins, migrant workers, and indigenous peoples. While of course there is a particularity to each situation of human life, from multitude to multitude, the universality of human dignity and the entitlement to rights across sectors of society must be accorded equally. And the framework to liberate identities must, without condition, consider the historical exigencies of the Philippine state as a nation yet to decolonize itself. However, hope remains in the hands of trans women and their co-conspirators on the ground in the grassroots of advocacy, community work, activism, pedagogy, as well as in the professions where more and more trans women have represented in real life what trans artists have imagined in their works. These women have collaborated with each other in educating the populace, especially the youth, on gender justice, premised on intersectionality and post-coloniality, with the mission to transform institutions such as health and pushing for trans affirmative care. During the COVID pandemic, my colleagues and I at the Society of Trans Women of the Philippines launched a fundraising drive to aid more than 100 sisters all over the country. As trans-identified medical practitioners have embedded themselves in practices of health and well-being, we see trans clinics provide consultancy in hormone therapy, as well as gender affirmation procedure, not to mention a proactive campaign on HIV/AIDS literacy and the promotion of a trans-focused mental health program within the trans community itself. As well, these women have persisted to create relations in the transnational and global networks of knowledge exchange, not only in the Asia-Pacific region, but also in various parts of the global south, like in Brazil. And I'm here to share how I've learned so much from sisters there and commit to ensuring their liberation further. Trans women in Brazil and the Philippines may have divergent histories to tell, and yet we inspire each other to look after every other sister beyond Latin America and Southeast Asia. The right to one's name and the marker of identity and to one's affirmative body may not have arrived yet in Philippine shores, but the Brazilian narrative has a lot to teach Filipino trans women on what paths they can take to assert their womanhood in the nearest horizon of the future. Brazilian trans women and travestis can look at their trans benign sisters, translating between trans and vernacular categories of gender diversity like the bakla, and recall how their negotiations with Bisha culture have also solidified multiple pathways towards self-determination. Linguistic diversity in the Philippines does not only signify the diversity of regional dialects or one dominant language, but a diversity of languages itself. This makes for a situation where trans has to be literally translated, and categories of gender vary by both region and language. The vernacularity of travesti and bicha accounts for possibilities of self-identification, particular to the Brazilian gender-diverse experience, escaping Western categories that tend to efface a diversity of genders elsewhere whenever trans and queer, for example, travel. The Philippine trans experience of a recurrent wave of fascism reminds their Brazilian cohorts of similar structures of oppression which repeat in their own history. And trans protagonists from both localities can only converse and think through the force that will allow waves of dissent to resurface and settle on the ground of permanent change, so that storms and stresses of white colonial patriarchy can thrive no more. The role that these assemblages play is definitely revolutionary. And this evening, we're also here to learn from you, colleagues in South Africa, to continue this fight. Thank you so much.
I don't know if I'm allowed to speak right now, so please let me know if I can
Yes, go
continue.
ahead.
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for this invitation, and I'm so sorry because we have been so busy, and I know it was supposed to happen a little bit, a couple of months ago, but me and JJ, we are doing a lot of things, and me particularly, I have been engaging, I traveled to another around the country and Latin America. So I was in Colombia this year, then I went to the United States, and it has been so many things. So thank you for your patience and to make this possible, because I think it's important to connect with colleagues from South Africa. I was in Cape Town last year, and I was like impressed. It's so beautiful, and so people were so welcoming. And I felt really inspired by South African resistance. So thank you once again for inviting us for this talk. I had prepared a paper, but I'm not going to read it. And then I can send it to you later with the PowerPoint I did. But basically, I want to speak about cisgenderity as a tool of power, as a assemblage of power. Because during my postdoctoral, actually during my doctoral research, I just realized that we had been discussing cisgenderity, but cisgenderity itself was not being so well defined, in my opinion, because there are ideas of cisgenderity happens or occurs when there's an opposition, another side, the transsexuality. In my opinion, this binary view is not productive to understand the lines of powers and lines of forces and knowledge that can produce a kind of things that I call social reality, or real social in Portuguese, like a real social way of existing. There is something really interesting going on in Brazil, because we are kind of leading the advance in terms of rights in Latin America, and also the global South, I believe. But at the same time, we are facing a high levels of violence. So we have like these, the right to name, the free medical care, free affirmative gender care, and we have this kind of new legislation that allows transgender women to be recognized in their places, including them into the labor market and so on. But still, we have to go through a lot of violence. Brazil is among one of the countries with the highest level of violence and murder against our community. And most of these persons are Black and racialized ones. So I was like, oh my gosh, what's going on? What's happening between this tension? Because I'm not sure if you are aware, but Brazil is leading the hunk, a horrible hunk of mortality against transgender persons, but also Brazil is leading the rank of country where there are more consumption of pornography with transgender women. So this contradiction, or not a contradiction in reality, between desire and disgust is what interested me to think. And that's why I came up with the idea to think about, to look to the media, what media was presenting about us, and how the society itself was seeing us, how the society think about us. Because of that, I started looking into the media. Like, I started watching soap operas, I started watching series, I started to listen to music, reading books on where there are some impersonator. I'm not impersonator. I'm not sure with the correct word. When do we have a representation of transsexuality? And in all those cases, I found out that transsexuality have been the approach was always negative. There were something we were represented as demons, as sociopaths, as killers, as rapers in the mainstream media since 1950. And then, on the other hand, I started to look how the cisgenderity, especially the idea of normal, appeared or was shown in our media, our mainstream media from 1950. And I found out that 1950, yeah, 50. So I found out that the representation was like an idea of evangelical, the true family, and they were teaching how women to be women, how men should be men. This kind of layers of representation were always pushing transsexuality representation into a place of negation, a displaced place, a displaced gender or identity. Like, there were no possible place for us. So because of that, I decided to take the cisgenderity as not as in the position of a transgender, like cisgenderity do not exist as in opposition to a transgenderity, but rather establish itself as an analytical category within the power landscapes, produce and invent transgenderity or transsexuality. And by doing that, the cisgenderity was inventing itself, but inventing itself as normal, ideal, biological, correct, sacred, whole, or whatever. And that was like, oh my gosh, this place of universality that cisgenderity was taking had nothing to do with this idea, the classical idea that transsexuality, cisgender is the one who is not transgender. Rather than looking into this binary category, I was very much willing to understand how modes or way of subjectification was going on, what kind of tools and device was being invented to place cisgenderity in a place of universality. And when I mean that cisgender were invented, I'm not saying that it didn't exist. saying that it was invented is to understand how, when, and in what ways this form of subjectivity becomes an important element, both from a discursive perspective and from a standpoint of social praxis, gaining meaning within certain regimes of truths. And so I decided to take the cisgender as an analytical category, not as just a mere gender identity. This is because cisgenderity regulates a kind of political authority upon the media, and the ways of semiotic structure are negotiated and produce meaning to the Brazilian society. So I'm not going to show you, but I can share with you the PowerPoint later. I started analyzing some propaganda, a lot of propaganda, pieces of propaganda from this period, from 1950 to the current times, to 2021, I believe I went to 2022. And I call this kind of propaganda of propaganda cisgenderity propaganda. And it only occurs because a cognitive dispositive is invented to make our gaze to automatically understand what is the threat, what is the other, who is those ones who put under risk the norm and the modes of control the society. And it only occurs because the propaganda cisgenderity propaganda only occurs by or through these cis gays. Like the cis gays just make automatic our understanding about what is a transgender person and why this or that person is dangerous somehow. I think like when I was looking into that pictures and seeing the kind of stereotypes, and then just looking into the Brazilian laws to understand how legislation was being discussed with the society, it was like shocking, because I just found out that cisgender was have always been there, but it has never been enunciated. Like it was there silently. While expressing or enunciating the other cisgenderity was like inventing and enunciating itself in a very quiet and discreet way, but also so loud, so visible, and in the same time, not possible to recognize, because our eyes and our bodies and subjectivity was trained to understand that as normal. So placing this kind of representation in the place of normal, of course, it would like, how can I say that in English? It would like reflect on how the Brazilian law produce a kind of enemy that strengthens the normality and the stability of the society. Since the dictatorship in Brazil and in Latin America, it is not different from what occurs, from what happens in the Philippines, in South Africa, in India. I've been engaging with activists from India in the region of Manipur, and the same level of the same kind, the same layer of representativity was being negotiated with the society. And that was like something really weird to understand how the media need our bodies to reinforce the place of power and normality and authority that cisgender occupy, or that places cisgenderity in a place of, or in a level of regular, ideal, heavenly, divine, whatever. What else? I feel also that when we go into some levels of how the society, how the Brazilian society, especially in a country, I'm not sure if you know that Brazil was the last country in the Western to abolish the slavery. And to understand and to look into the numbers and see that most of the persons who were killed in Brazil were Black and indigenous. That was the tradition, you know what I mean? To have these people being killed more than the others is scary, of course, but I mean, it's the tradition. It's a country that thought us as enemy, that have us as threats, that should be I don't know, separated from the rest of the society. So kill us was part of the tradition. To exclude us from school, it was part of the tradition, but it was part of the tradition because a normal was invented, and the media itself reinforced this idea of normal when presents and creates levels of representation that puts transgender persons and bodies and subjectivity in a place of demoniac materiality, material. Like, I think I'm going to stop here because of time, and then we can discuss a little bit more about this. Thank you.